Hello and welcome to Free Speech Unmuted. My co-host is Jane Babauer from the University of Florida. I'm Eugene Volokh from the Hoover Institution at Stanford and formerly, well, I guess still emeritus at UCLA Law School. And we have a special guest here, Stuart Benjamin, who's a professor at Duke Law School and who is an expert in the specialized law having to do with federal communications, and in particular federal communications and broadcasting content regulation. And we're going to be talking today about some of the controversies in the news having to do with the equal time rule. And various various television talk shows and what it says with regard to their inviting political candidates on. So I wanted to start by asking Stuart to give us the lay of the land on this. So it turns out, and many people in the audience may know this, although may not know the full scope of it, the rules for broadcast radio and television, over-the-air broadcast radio and television, have long been very different from a First Amendment perspective than those for newspapers, for the internet, or for that matter, even for cable television. Stuart, tell us a little bit about that difference. Now, I know that this difference is quite controversial. You have criticized this different treatment. I'm generally no fan of this different treatment. But tell us what the Supreme Court and what other courts have generally said about this.
Great.
Over the decades.
Thanks, Eugene and Jane. Happy to be here. So this began when in 1927 via statute, the government said that it controlled all the spectrum and gave out only licenses to use spectrum. This was first discussed extensively in a case from 1943, NBC versus United States, in which the Supreme Court said that the spectrum is uniquely scarce, and so it requires that the government control the spectrum, and thus the licensing regime makes sense. And then fast forward to 1969, there was a challenge to what is known as the Fairness Doctrine, and the court in Red Lion, again relying on spectrum scarcity, said that it is totally appropriate for and legal for the government to impose the Fairness Doctrine on broadcasters because in light of this scarcity, there has to be some rationing of voices. And this is also consistent with a view of the First Amendment as actually empowering the government. And so the government actually had an appropriate role in ensuring that we, the people, were exposed to a wide range of voices. Now, at that point, there was no reason to think that there was anything unique about broadcast regulation. And so 5 years later, when the Supreme Court considers Miami Herald versus Tornillo, involving the exact same kind of rule as applied to newspapers, of course, the briefs in support of Tornillo cited Red Lion Passim. Right, Red Lion is a good principle that applies across the board, and the Supreme Court did not discuss Red Lion and said that it was absolutely unconstitutional to have the exact same sort of regime that applies to print than broadcasting. So all of a sudden, something that could have been a rule that applied across the board wasn't. Same kind of thing happened with respect to indecency. Some of the things, just to get ahead of where we are, but some of the things that Brendan Carr has done are he wants to prevent certain kinds of harmful programming, which is separate from equal time. But in any event, that would rely on a case called Pacifica involving the broadcasting of indecency. The Supreme Court said broadcast is unusually pervasive, and so the government has an interest in regulating it, and then Congress, in its wisdom, chose to regulate indecency on every other major means of communication: telephone, cable television, the internet. In every one of those cases, Pacifica was Passim in the government's brief, cited over and over again. And in every one of those cases, the court said, no, actually, this is different. Broadcasting is special. So we have this regime of the specialness of broadcasting. And again, to be clear, Red Line is more directly relevant to equal time. I'm just trying to give the big picture. We have a regime that is now broadcast specific. It wasn't designed necessarily as being broadcast specific. Many people, after Red Line was decided, thought it would be a springboard to a very different vision of communications regulation that would empower the government to apply all sorts of things that would be like equal time rules. It's just not how the case law developed. Now, if I can just give one more minute now on the statutory side, the equal time rule applies to broadcasters, but you could easily imagine that a later Congress, if the case law had worked out differently, would have then extended that and applied that to cable television, who knows what, to the internet, et cetera. Given the way the case is developed, and given various changes on the court and off, I think that was never going to go anywhere, and so it just never went anywhere. So we now have a constitutional regime that is broadcast specific and a statutory regime that is broadcast specific.
Well, great that you laid it out for us. Maybe not a great regime. By the way, I should say, for the benefit of our listeners who don't speak Latin, Stuart, when he was saying, cited passim or passims, pronounced different ways. It's the way we lawyers learn this mixture of English and Latin. It basically means cited throughout a document.
The joke, just for the benefit of listeners, the joke being, in a brief, if you cite something on 8 different pages, you list the 8 different pages. If you cite it on every other page, you don't even bother listing the pages. So it's just understood. It's throughout your brief.
Exactly. But Stuart's point was that all of these broadcast precedents were cited throughout in all follow-on cases where people tried to apply them to newspapers, to the internet and such. And the courts ended up saying over time, nope, that's broadcast, that's different. So we do have this weird regime, and we do have the statute. Tell us specifically about the equal time rule, because the fairness doctrine, of course, was rejected, even though it was upheld by the Supreme Court in 1969. In the 1980s, it was rejected by the Federal Communications Commission as being unconstitutional, even though the Supreme Court had upheld it. But in any event, the FCC was entitled to say, we no longer think this is called for here. But the equal time rule is a statute, and it's still there. And it's different from the fairness doctrine, although not completely unrelated. Tell us about the equal time.
Sure. And let me connect out the way it was interpreted on the fairness doctrine rejection point. So this is a statute. I mean, the first version of it was in the Federal Radio Act of 1927, but the version that we know was codified much later in 47 U.S.C. 315A, and it says that a broadcaster, if a broadcaster allows a political candidate to use its station, it shall afford equal opportunities to all the other candidates for that office. But importantly, it has exemptions. And so that does not apply to bona fide newscast, news interview, news documentary, or on-the-spot coverage of bona fide news events. So there are these exemptions to the requirements. If you are not in one of those exemptions, so you have one candidate on, then you have to give equal airtime. So whatever it is the first candidate got, the other candidates have to get. So if you want to have a candidate on, and you don't want to have all the candidates on, you want to fit into one of these exemptions. Because just to be clear, if you don't fit into one of these exemptions, then you have to afford the candidate's opponents the same opportunities that you gave to the candidate that you had on your show.
Right. So it's not the equal time rule is not a prohibition on having candidates on, but it's kind of like a tax on having candidates on. Because if you have on a candidate whom you want to have on for various reasons, you think their audience might like, or you just want to support them, you then have to pay the tax in the form of having the rival or rivals to the candidate on if they so ask. And so it's a burden on the ability to put the candidate on your program. And probably, all things being equal, would tend to push broadcasters away from having candidates on because they don't want to have, nobody likes to pay taxes. They want to have to pay this tax. But of course, there is this exception for bona fide news. And the question is, what counts as bona fide news? Tell us what has in the past counted as bona fide news and what's going on with it now.
The big change came in the Reagan administration. Under the FCC in the 1970s embraced the fairness doctrine, which again plays out very similarly actually to equal time. It also in effect imposes a tax then on carrying some things, and that was what was and it was that rationale that the court used in Tornillo to invalidate a similar rule for newspapers. So it was in the Reagan administration that they abandoned the fairness doctrine and that they broadened out these exemptions. And that is not a coincidence. I think that the Reagan administration probably thought that, I mean, correctly, the equal time rule relies on exactly the same constitutional theory as the fairness doctrine, but they couldn't repeal the equal time rule because it's in a statute. So what do they do? What do they have the authority to do? They have the authority to interpret the equal time rule as narrowly as possible. They can't get rid of it. So what do? They start broadly interpreting it. So the first big broad interpretation involved a show involving someone named Phil Donahue, who had a daytime talk show where he would have guests and then he would go to the audience and he would talk to people in the audience, and sometimes he would have wanted to have political candidates on, and so they filed in the FCC, and the FCC initially said, no, you don't fall into any of these news exemptions, and then the FCC then versed itself, obviously under the under the influence of the Reagan chair, and said, no, you actually fall under the news exemption under equal time rules, so you can have on a political candidate without having on their opponents. After that, there were a bunch of other cases involved. I don't know how many listeners will remember Jerry Springer, whose programs generally tended toward titles like "Am I Really the Father?" And this was not news. Nobody claimed this was news in any way, but nonetheless, it fell under the exemption for those unusual times when it might have a political candidate. And then Politically Incorrect with Bill Maher, which was a discussion show, was a politically inflected discussion, but it talked about lots of other things. The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, and then perhaps the one that was the most hard to say, but this one might have been the most notorious. It certainly produced the most laughter, was the Howard Stern Show, when one of the great ripostes to that from somebody who was critical of this said, I'm quoting here, when guests are selected by the size of their bust, it is not bona fide news programming. And so after that series of cases, and I've just run through cases that started in 1984 and Howard Stern was in 2003. It was quite clear to everyone that they were interpreting this news exemption very broadly, very capaciously, and effectively were meaning that it would rarely apply. And again, I think it was a sense of the FCC wanting to constrain itself. It wanted to constrain itself in the context of the fairness doctrine, and it wanted to constrain itself in times of the equal time rule. And this was a way of exercising that constraint. And the really interesting thing is that constraint held from Reagan through Trump 1 through Biden until January 20th, 2025. This was a long consensus about, in general, constraining FCC broadcast regulation. I have an article forthcoming in Eugene's Journal on this very issue. That was a long-standing consensus that has now been disrupted. And let me turn now to the FCC's implementation that it developed over the course of these various proceedings involving Donahue, Jerry Springer, et cetera. There were 3 and only 3 stated standards. One is that it's a regularly scheduled program. Okay, that's not a very high bar. The second is that the producers of the program control the program, they mean producers as opposed to the broadcaster. So it doesn't look like the broadcaster is pulling the strings behind the scene. Again, that's a low bar for all of these programs. The producer controls the program. The third is that the producer's decision on format, content, and participants are based on newsworthiness and not an intention to advance or harm an individual's candidacy. Now, that third element, you could imagine having some bite. And what's interesting is, nonetheless, when Arnold Schwarzenegger wanted to be on the Tonight Show, they said, "Oh yeah, this is clearly not about Arnold Schwarzenegger. It's back that Arnold Schwarzenegger is a prominent person." And when Howard Stern wanted to have various candidates on, it was, "Oh, Howard Stern wants ratings." Et cetera. And so again, you could imagine that somebody might look at what some of these shows did and said, "No, I think the reason you're having this politician on is to help their candidacy." And the FCC consistently resolved that in favor of a broad exemption, in favor of the broadcaster, and therefore in favor of the broadcaster not having to comply with the equal time rule.
So that's very helpful summary of the law and how things have traveled in some measure up until the most recent steps. So let's turn to them. So right now, this is all in the news because of the controversies involving Representative Tallarico, who is running for the Texas Senate seat on the Democratic side, but in the primary right now against Representative Jasmine Crockett is his main adversary. Although there's another third candidate in the primary as well, and he was on The View, and that drew a reaction from the FCC. There was talk of him being on Colbert, and then he wasn't. And the interesting question is whose behest exactly. But tell us about that and how it fits within that legal framework.
When he was on The View, at that time, Brendan Carr had some rumblings that maybe this was not consistent with the equal time rule. Nothing, at least that we know of, nothing particularly came of that. And then more recently, you had the Colbert incident where, just to be clear, what Colbert said, I have no reason not to believe him, was that if he had Tallarico on, he would have to have on the two people who were running against him. And the answer is, so it was not that CBS said, you can't have Tallarico on, period. It was your point about a tax. If you want to have Tallarico on, you're now going to have to devote 3 times as many minutes to this Texas race as you had planned on devoting to it. And that just for somebody who has a show, that's obviously then gonna change the calculus. And then more recently, Brendan Carr has announced that they are in fact investigating The View, suggesting that maybe The View has not complied with the equal time rule by having on Tallarico. Now, to a point that you were implicitly getting at earlier, there's only technically a violation of the equal time rule if somebody asks you for equal time and you deny it to them. But so why would Carr be doing this? I think he would in fact be saying, we want someone to ask them for time. We will look favorably on someone who asks for equal time if their opponent has been on one of these programs, The View, Colbert, et cetera. So there's not a technical violation. But the irony of this is the person who has most conflated that in the recent past is Brendan Carr himself, who, after Kamala Harris was on Saturday Night Live, said this violates the equal time rule, when the answer is no, it doesn't violate the equal time rule unless she was running against Donald Trump at that point, unless Donald Trump asks for equal time and is denied it. But you can understand colloquially why it is treated as a violation of equal time if you have only the one person on, because the assumption is you wouldn't allow their opponent to go on. So that's at least the background of why some people conflate or confuse what is the actual violation of the rule. Because just to be clear, nobody wants to have to devote 3 times as much airtime to a race as they had planned to, and so that then just changes the calculus of what you're willing to have on your show.
All right. So now I think we have the big picture laid out. took a while because there's a lot to lay out. So from a First Amendment perspective, the law does indeed give the government more authority to regulate broadcast radio and television. Maybe if the issue comes up to the court again, maybe the Supreme Court will say that was all a mistake. Certainly some justices have argued that. Justice Thomas had argued that. Justice Ginsburg had argued that with regard to indecency. But right now, that seems to be the rule. There's also a statute that does indeed mandate provision of equal time. Congress did say so. But the statute has this exemption that the FCC has at times read more narrowly way back when, then started to read very broadly, and now is reading narrowly again. So that's the issue. So on one hand, the statute is out there. On the other hand, the FCC has read it narrowly before. Maybe it should keep reading it narrowly, or maybe that was a mistake. So those are some of the questions. I wanted to ask, though, a bigger picture issue. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, Stuart. I think I know your thoughts, but the audience doesn't know your thoughts. And I'd love to hear Jane's views on this as well. So the equal time rule has one advantage over the old fairness doctrine. It is pretty clear. It doesn't just maybe except for the bona fide news exception. It doesn't say, well, for any kind of controversial issue, you have to have responsible alternative views, and then whose alternative view do you present when there are so many different ones? If there's a race, there are usually particular candidates on the other side, although maybe in a primary it could be a lot. In this case, there are three. So it's relatively clear, and I take it this would be the strongest argument, I think, for this, which is that when it comes to broadcasting regulations, there are actually two kinds of broadcasting regulations. One is the ones we've been talking about, like the old fairness doctrine, like the equal time rule. And those are the regulations that impose a modest burden on a tiny fraction of the population, those people who have broadcast licenses. And there's a second kind of regulation, which is it is illegal to broadcast without a broadcast license. That imposes a massive burden on the overwhelming majority of the population. So if I am, God forbid, running for office against, say, Jane, and I happen to have the ear of some talk show host or something like that, then the talk show host could have me on, and then, but if he could say no to Jane, and Jane would have no alternative unless she also has some friends who are talk show hosts. And if she just decides, oh, I'm just going to go out there and broadcast myself, the way if it's a newspaper, you could maybe print up leaflets, hand them out on the street corner or whatever else, it would be illegal for her to broadcast herself. So the argument would be that when it gets to elections, which are competitive things, where the point is to have some relative equality between the candidates, at least when it comes to governmentally kind of supplied or supported resources, that when you've got this kind of competitive process, it should be made fair. And once the government says, look, most people can't broadcast. You get only people with a special government-provided license can broadcast. The government ought to be able to say, well, if you do get the special government-provided license, you've got to be even-handed in your treatment of the candidates. That strikes me as perhaps the strongest argument I can imagine making for the equal time rule. What do you think about that?
So a few things. So first, I do think, and many other people think, I mean, in some ways, the key move here was the government's ipse dixit. We're going to license spectrum as opposed to.
And ipse dixit is Latin for more or less just because we said so.
I will try to use less Latin.
It's okay. It's okay. I just need to be there to interpret. I'm bilingual.
So the first thing is I do think a lot of this depends on the government's decision to license. And by the way, that goes back, part of the reason I was emphasizing this NBC versus United States case, which is why in the world does the government treat this differently from land? So, economists find that ridiculous. So fine, spectrum is scarce. Everything that has more demand for supply than there is supply is scarce. And so there's nothing special about spectrum at that point. So the first thing is to say, yes, in some ways the licenses are doing a fair amount of work. Having said that, I think there's two problems with the how much we can prove by the license argument. One a theoretical one, and then one more practical one. The theoretical one is, okay, so what if the government says we're really worried about steel, and so we're going to claim ownership of all steel in this country, and we're not going to let any imports in of steel. And by the way, that means then anybody who wants a printing press, it was made out of steel, so you'll have to come to us to get a license for the steel, and we will give out licenses on some reasonable, rational basis. I don't have the slightest doubt that the Supreme Court would say, no, sorry, you may be able to license steel, but you can't leverage that into control over newspapers. So I don't think that the mere fact of the license ultimately really answers the theoretical question. And then there's the practical point. Again, something that will be news probably to most of the listeners of this program. But in the 1970s, the three major television broadcast networks had a market share of more than 90%. So it really was the case that if your political opponent was on the local television station and you were not, this was a really serious problem for your political campaign. It's just not the world that we live in anymore, where for the vast majority of Americans, a broadcast station is just another channel. Actually, it's just another stream that they have
Right.
access to. And so it just seems to me it's really hard now to make an argument that there's anything particularly special about the role of broadcasting. And if I could just add in that regard, note that Brendan Carr has never suggested, oh, by the way, Congress, I think you should also extend these rules to cable television, for instance. So one way in which viewers, I hope, realize, so Fox News is a cable television program, so it is not subject. Nothing on Fox News or otherwise can ever be subject to the equal time rules because it's not a broadcaster. But if we think this is a great set of rules, okay, why don't we go ahead and license the cable television stations as well, and then leverage that similarly. I just think it again, just the practical point is it's hard for me to see, to use a technical term, I don't think this is Latin, much oomph in an argument.
Not Latin.
Not Latin? Oh, I thought it was Latin. Maybe it's Pig Latin.
Yeah.
Much oomph today in the argument that you, Eugene, are articulating.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say in our hypothetical campaign against each other, Eugene, yeah, you can go to a broadcast show on ABC, but luckily I know Joe Rogan, so...
Oh, well, better yet.
So actually that I want to ask another question about the pragmatics before turning you back to the First Amendment question, Stuart. Eugene referenced the broadcast license as something that's valuable, as if it's so it's a massive burden that another show wouldn't be able to broadcast. Why is and so I get the sense that one reason we have this fight is that all of these shows, even though they can be streamed, even though they can be on cable or could potentially be on cable and could certainly be streamed over the internet, the license is still valuable. So can you just explain why broadcast is still such a valuable technology?
So it's a great question. So first things first, it turns out that broadcast stations, which again once had 90%, and just three networks had 90% of the audience, still has about 20% of the market share, which may or may not surprise you. And there are some populations for whom broadcast is a bigger deal. So broadcast watching tends to skew older.
And they won't go they wouldn't travel with their show to a different transmission.
But they might. I mean, they might. But I mean, for some people, this is they have grown up watching their local television news, and that's the show they're gonna keep on watching. And then the idea would be, and then they leave it on during the day, and that's how they catch The View, and that's how they see the the Tonight Show or anything else. So look, I do think that there is still some power to to broadcasting. I just let me put it to you this way. I mean, this is yet a different level of the pragmatics. If I am the campaign advisor to Jasmine Crockett, do I actually push for the equal time opportunity? I might not. This is part of the reason why Brendan Carr might want her to, but it doesn't mean she's actually. I might not, because I might say, I don't think there's that many viewers, and I think I might come off as kind of the sore loser, malcontent. And so I actually think I'm just better off not even pushing this in the first place, because it just isn't that many voters at the end of the day.
Let's go back to the First Amendment question, though. In that context where the licenses might be of waning value, though not valueless for the reasons you say, and there are so many other options, cable, internet, etc. Do you think that the Supreme Court, even on the same facts and assessing the same rules that they've looked at before in Pacifica or in Red Lion, would come to the same conclusion today?
I do not. I should say, when I was just starting out as an academic back in the dark ages, I made a bet with Larry Lessig about the Supreme Court overruling Red Lion. We both thought they would overrule it. The question was whether they have an opportunity to. And they haven't. And they haven't had an opportunity to overrule Pacifica. And there's a reason for that, which is that the FCC has done so little, right? Again, it's pulled back so much that there isn't much to sue the FCC over to either challenge Red Lion or Pacifica. I will note that this did come up. There was a brief rise in FCC enforcement on indecency. And so this involved Cher and on the Golden Globe and Denise Richie on the Golden Globes. This made it to the Supreme Court. They ended up not deciding this case on First Amendment grounds. But at the oral argument, Justice Alito said, it's an argument for why they shouldn't get into the First Amendment issue. He said, isn't broadcast going to go the way of the 8-track tape player anyway? And so why would we even need to get into this First Amendment issue since it's dying? I have to imagine that the broadcasters in the audience at the Supreme Court were not amused by that question from Justice Alito. But yeah, I think that most people think if they actually had a chance to squarely reconsider Red Lion and Pacifica, I think most people think it would overrule Pacifica, and I think most people also think they probably overrule Red Lion. And so one way of thinking about the FCC's constraining itself is, I think it was originally done because the Reagan FCC really did think this was just an intrusion on the First Amendment. But an additional reason, as the years have gone on, might be, and we the FCC are going to lose if we try to get more aggressive.
Do you think even that the fleeting expletive, like the fleeting expletive case, was the most recent of these kind of very content oriented cases that the Supreme Court decided? Is that right? Am I right about that? Okay.
Yes, and that's where Alito said that at oral argument, but they didn't get to the First Amendment issue.
Oh, that's the one. Okay, okay, got it. Okay, yeah, because that was in the internet era, and yet it's okay. So they avoided the.
Right. They decided on due process grounds. They had another constitutional provision they could throw in there.
Okay.
I was just going to say, this has been very interesting and I hope enlightening. It's been enlightening to me. I hope it's been even more enlightening to the audience. And I wanted to thank Stuart very much for coming on our program.
Sure. Happy to do it.
Jane, thank you as well, as always. And thanks to our listeners for listening. And we'll be having more in the weeks to come.
Thank you all.
This podcast is a production of the Hoover Institution, where we generate and promote ideas advancing freedom. For more information about our work, to hear more of our podcasts, or view our video content, please visit hoover.org.